Wonderful. So yeah, just thank you everyone. Welcome to Building a Prosperous Economy for All, how investors can address racial injustice and unleash economic growth. We are so excited to have you here. And my name is Whitney Shepard, and I help to lead the strategy of racial justice here at Majority Action. As you all know, Majority Action is a nonprofit organization that empowers shareholders to hold corporations accountable to high standards of corporate governance, social responsibility, and long-term value creation. We are also so honored to host this webinar in partnership with Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, who's an organization of over 2 million members that are dedicated to improving the lives of workers and their families and creating a more just and humane society. On behalf of Majority Action and SEIU and all of our esteemed panelists, we again welcome you and thank you so much again for joining us this afternoon. And before we get started, though, I do want to mention one thing. I am not Renee Manley, and unfortunately, Renee Manley is unable to join us today due to a family emergency. And so, as we know, Renee Manley is a brilliant and dynamic leader and who uses her role as the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives at SEIU to really drive racial equity and responsible investing. And so a lot of what we will discuss today has been made possible by Renee's thoughtful leadership, and we are going to be holding her very close in our thoughts as we continue on with this session, but also want to uplift and appreciate all that she did to make today's session possible. And so I will be stepping in as moderator today in her absence. And so, yes, again, thank you all for your understanding with that. Again, my name is Whitney Shepard. I'm here with Majority Action and just wanted to run through just a couple of logistics for us at the top of the hour, or hour and 15 minutes actually, that we'll have together to really dig into how investors can address racial injustice. So just a few logistics as we move forward. For Zoom, this, as you know, I think when you entered, you probably were notified that this webinar is being recorded. And so just uplifting that again for your information. And also we do have closed captioning available for any participants that may need that. In order to enable that, you'll just go to your Zoom toolbar. There should be a little section that's titled CC or closed captioning in order to enable that. If in fact you're having any issues with your Zoom logistics or those things are not appearing for you, you can chat to the panelists and host section using the chat function, and we will be sure to address any of those needs. We have some folks on our back end that are helping support us in the back behind the scenes. So please feel free to utilize that chat function and specifically select for that panelist and host if you're having any issues that are not content related or not meant for the general audience to see. We're also going to be using the question and answer function of the Zoom webinars features. And so if you'll see on the Zoom toolbar, if you don't see it, you'll just have to go to the top or bottom of your screen, and you should see a Q&A section. And so as our panelists are speaking and comments are being shared, we're asking that you please utilize that function to uplift any questions that you have, and we will spend the last part of our section today answering and engaging as many questions as possible. And I think the only other update I have for folks is that there is going to be several interactive poll questions that we do ask the audience, just to kind of gauge who is in the space with us today and get a sense of where we are in our racial equity processes. And those will be 4 questions that are shared throughout. Those will remain anonymous and again are just more so used to kind of fill out who's in the space and where we've been and where we want to go in terms of this. So before I get to our esteemed panelists, which I'm so excited to have on our panel today, we just wanted to do a little bit of setting the space as to why we got here, how we are here. As you all may know and have been informed, Majority Action, in partnership with SEIU, has released its annual report, this 3rd edition of Equity in the Boardroom, which looks at the voting behavior from asset managers in the last 2022 proxy season and really measures their voting behavior and outsized power, and if they either helped advance or they hindered process in terms of racial equity. So please, if you have not already, we ask that you read and distribute this report wide and far. You can find it at that website that's linked below on this slide. A lot of great contributions were made and many partners made this work possible. In particular, I'm also wanting to shout out primary author here, Pilar Sorensen, who was for the last couple of years been primary author on this report and did an incredible amount of work at Majority Action to get this together. And so she's on I believe and on staff as well at Majority Action. So there's questions about the report, you just know we are always available to engage and want to answer and hear your feedback on our findings. And so I won't go too much into the details. Luckily, one of our panelists, Eli Kazargad-Staub, will speak to the findings in the report and kind of give you more details on what's going on there. But I wanted to more so point to the idea of why an annual release for equity in the boardroom, right? So equity in the boardroom, first released kind of post the summer of George Floyd in 2020. We're seeing this as a increasingly important need for investors to be engaged in. And as we release this report in 2023, that's looking at 2022 on the heels of Tyree Nichols and other incidents, we continue to see that systemic racism is an issue that plagues our society that we need to continue to take seriously at all levels. And we can all do our part to really, engage in here and really fight for a better future and a more prosperous society and economy for all of us. And I think that we continue to see that there's many commitments that are being made by businesses, especially in the wake of the summer 2020, especially in the wake of these whirlwind moments. And we're continuing to see that some of these corporate performances are not matching the rhetoric. And so reports like Equity in the Boardroom and other reports continue to show us the data as to why racial justice and racial equity need to be considered as within our investment strategies and across the board. And I think just the last thing I will offer is that we did intentionally also hold this event within Black History Month. We had the intention of holding this in Black History Month, knowing that shareholder activism and the work that we do is a direct continuation of the civil rights movement, and honoring that part of Black history, and really seeing that a lot of what was the civil rights movement fought for through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who used shareholder activism not only to buy shares at Dobbs Corporation and sit at lunch counters where they could be business or shareholders, but not be able to sit at segregated lunch counters, and really leveraging or that contradiction of what that meant for society, as to continuing to mapping out the Chamber of Commerce in the local areas to really inform people around the way that corporate power was showing up in their lives and control. That we saw these actions then lead to such breakthroughs, such as the Civil Rights Movement in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which then of course led to the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, and a lot of that good work that we were able to live through. But I think another important part of the context is the backlash that we received after the Civil Rights Movement that we are living within as well. And so many of the things that we fought for in terms of non-discrimination clauses and fair housing and voting rights, right, are still very much something active fights that we are bringing here today. And so really wanting to draw that connection for those of us in the audience that are here committed to racial equity, and really trying to find different ways in which to activate that commitment. And so again, thank you all so much for joining us. We have an outstanding panel that's going to be able to speak to these issues a lot better than I can. So I'm going to wrap up my comments here and go to introducing some of our incredible speakers that we have today, and just reminding us that we've had the chance to kind of reflect on the civil rights movement, and Black History Month is an incredible opportunity to do that. And to, I think part of the most pertinent part of the reflection is looking back and seeing that the demands that were being made were not, radical, although they were being painted are so, right? They were really asking for some basic rights to be met. And we are living in a times where words are charged in a negative way on purpose. So when we hear civil rights or racial equity, corporate accountability, racial equity audit, right, that these words are actually don't carry the negative charge that some may try to draw on them, and that there's an opportunity for us that are in that fight to engage in using as a positive charge to those words, and that they're not in fact controversial, and there are bars that are here to be met. And so there's a lot of good work to be done, and just kind of encouraging us that those of us kind of in this realm, that there will be backlash, but it doesn't necessarily, that we can also pay attention to what's really being said there. So again, I'm gonna kick it to myself to introduce our amazing panelists who we have. And sorry, that is that. And I don't have my notes there, but so we have the incredible opportunity to engage New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, who was elected to serve as New York City's budget watchdog and chief accountability officer in 2021. Lander's background in community organizing and urban planning informs his work to make government work better for all New Yorkers. And Yeah, excuse me, sorry, my notes are not showing up here, but I'm doing a little reading from the slide. But first elected to the City Council in 2009, Lander co-founded the Council's Progressive Caucus, has a strong track record of partnering with community advocates to win transformative change in a more just and equitable city. In the City Council, Lander has spearheaded efforts to protect workers and build a more equitable economy, working closely with labor advocates to win groundbreaking laws and end unfair firings to establish a fair work week for fast food workers, protect freelancers from wage theft, ban discriminatory credit checks for employment, and guarantee a living wage for the app-based drivers and delivery workers. So really, I mean, this is just scratching the surface, all the incredible work that Comptroller Lander has been able to achieve in his time. And yes, I think one of the other points is Lander was also one of the founders of Local Progress, which is now a 1,000 member strong network of local elected officials that are advancing a racial and economic justice agenda through all levels of local government. So welcome, Comptroller Lander. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much for that really overly generous introduction, Whitney, and thanks to you and Majority Action and SEIU. This is a great panel with great partners in the work of responsible fiduciary investing, which means confronting the risks that prevent shared economic thriving so we can build an economy that both is good for our returns, but also good across the economy. I want to mention I'm joined today by Yumi Narita from our corporate governance team, who will be around for the panel. And thank you so much for this opportunity. So in addition to the roles that Whitney mentioned, the New York City Comptroller is the custodian and trustee for the New York City retirement systems. That's $240 billion across the 5 pension funds that represent the retirement security of our public sector workers in New York City: teachers, firefighters, nurses, school crossing guards. And let's remember that those are funds that workers, public sector workers, won through their unions. And now we have the fiduciary responsibility to invest in a way that brings risk-adjusted maximum returns, so their retirement security will be there, but also pays attention to the risks that we face. And it's worth taking one quick step back to remember, especially for a pension fund like us with $240 billion under management and a long-term time horizon, because, we got people starting as public sector workers today for whom 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now, we'll be responsible for their retirement. So we're universal investors. That means we invest all across the economy, and the risks facing the economy broadly are risks facing our funds. We're long-term investors to meet those obligations out in the long term. So we can't say, well, this year something looks like a good idea without regard for what it means in the long term. Obviously, climate risk is financial risk, and it grows over time. And we've got a fiduciary duty to pay attention to long-term risk. And then also, we're tied to a public balance sheet. The same money that goes into those pension funds is the money that's paying for our public schools or our climate resilience or our workforce development training programs. And so we have to be thoughtful about our returns, but also about the implications for the other kind of expenditures New York City has to make. And when you look at it in that way and say, what does responsible fiduciary investing means? It means that as stewards, we have to think about the systemic risks that we're facing. So when we say climate risk is financial risk, it's a risk to our portfolio and to our city. And let's be clear, systemic racial inequalities and the lack of opportunities and the ways in which workers don't share fully in the benefits of the economy, those are systemic risks for long-term investors. The massive gaps in income and wealth between white families and Black families and Latino families, they don't just hurt communities, they undermine growth and long-term value creation all across our economy. So as pension stewards, as responsible fiduciary investors, we've got an obligation to pay close attention to how companies in our portfolio are addressing and managing those risks. That's why our office for years has been partners with many of you, and why we're pushing now. So I want to talk quickly about 3 kinds of shareholder initiatives: work we're doing for equity in the boardroom, work we're doing for equity in the workforce, and work we're doing around freedom of association and collective bargaining rights for workers to win more broad sharing of the thriving in their companies. And then I'll talk for 1 minute about this war on ESG and the backlash we're seeing at what it means for investors for the proxy season and for asset managers this year. So first, equity in the boardroom. We're proud to be fighting for and building on work that our funds have been doing for a while to push companies to have a board matrix that discloses both skill sets, but also the race, gender, and ethnicity of board members. Investors have long known that a diverse board in terms of relevant skills, race, gender, is an indicator of a well-functioning board. So you don't get hit by something that you weren't looking at because you just had all the same kind of people and they only knew how to look at one thing. And there's just a lot of evidence that diverse boards are better for protecting you against risk and seeing opportunities for value creation. During the 2022 proxy season, the New York City retirement systems targeted asset managers with prominent governance teams like BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, with a board matrix shareholder proposal, as these are the leading firms that could pave the way for getting disclosure like that all across the economy. And we were successful in getting those asset managers to disclose that information in their 2022 proxy statements. So this year we're pushing forward and we're looking specifically at the airline industry and the hotel hospitality sectors. Those are often companies with frontline workers, disproportionately people of color, but whose boards don't have the same level of diversity. And we think it's particularly important for those companies to be accountable to their diverse communities. We filed 13 proposals, and I'm pleased to tell you that at 7 of them, the companies agreed to use a board diversity matrix. That leaves 6 where we're still pushing. So as we get a little closer, we'll let other investors know and ask for people's support in the resolutions where necessary to vote to make them happen. A second, I want to talk about work to get equity in the workforce. Here, what we've done is to push for disclosure of companies' EEO-1 statements. EEO-1 reports, every large company has to do it already, and it reflects how many workers by different race and ethnicity you have at different levels of your company. So it really shows, are you building a genuinely equitable company, providing opportunities for people to grow and thrive, to earn more? In July 2020, to be fair, before I got here, but me and the team at the Corporate Governance Group were leading the way. When we launched this EEO-1 disclosure initiative, only 13 of the S&P 100 disclosed their EEO-1 statements. And I'm pleased to say that since through the shareholder campaigns and corporate engagement over the past 3 years, now more than 90 S&P 100 companies disclose their EEO-1s. And Bloomberg did some really interesting work that showed when companies disclose, they actually are more likely to confront pay disparity and make sure they achieve something closer to equity in their work. And we're going to keep pushing. So we filed a couple of more proposals at restaurant chains and department stores, targeting companies again, where many frontline workers are people of color. And I'm hopeful that we'll see folks agree because it's just becoming standard practice. One area, though, the third one that is not yet becoming standard practice is respecting the freedom of association of your workers. U.S. labor law, sadly, does not require respecting your workers' freedom of association. It allows companies to have captive audience meetings, to deny access if the union comes to organize. Doesn't require bargaining in good faith. It just says, don't break the law. And of course, we know plenty of times companies even go ahead and break the law. And yet many of those companies have signed on to the International Labor Organization's human rights standards. So for example, both Apple and Starbucks in their human rights policies declare that they're supporters of those ILO conventions, which include freedom of association. So what that means is if your workers choose to organize a union, you don't put your thumb on the scale against it. You don't have captive audience meetings. You don't deny them access to your workers. You respect their right to organize and choose or not choose to join a union as they wish. That's the International Labor Organization Convention, but unfortunately not required by US labor law. Some of these companies say they do it, but it's clear they're not doing it. So if you look at the conduct that both Apple and Starbucks have engaged in over the last year, there's a lot of reasons to worry. So we've brought corporate shareholder resolutions at a number of companies. And I'm pleased to say Apple has agreed to conduct a third-party assessment of its compliance or lack of compliance with these standards, that puts them in distinction from Starbucks, who not only have refused to engage with us in good faith, and every day more information comes out about the ways in which they appear to be violating their own standards. So we'll be going to a vote at Starbucks. We joined resolutions by the New York State Comptroller at Walmart and Gannett. And what we want to do here is not only win the resolutions this year, but help to raise the standard so that anybody that calls themselves a responsible corporation or says they've got ESG policy is expected to sign on to and respect their workers' freedom of association. I want to wrap up, so I won't talk too much about the war on ESG, except to say this. Red state treasurers are waging a war of political distraction at the behest of their fossil fuel and right-wing donors, trying to intimidate their asset managers from acting on their own basic fiduciary duty of responsible fiduciary investing. But the asset expectations for asset managers are clear. They can't abdicate their responsibility to clients like us or to their beneficiaries. If you know climate risk is financial risk, if you know inequality is financial risk, then you can't ignore it. The responsibilities of responsible fiduciary stewardship requires confronting and managing the risks we face. We're going to be pushing forward to do it. We'll be making clear to our asset managers, we expect them to act in that responsible way as well. That's why working together with groups like everyone on this call is so critical. Thank you for organizing this timely forum and inviting me. And I look forward to working together as we proceed into proxy season.
Thank you so much, Comptroller Lander. It's always good, so good to hear from you. And I think your office remains a strong example of what it means to really take a comprehensive approach to this. And it's not just one lane that you're in. And so to continue to see your leadership and the decarbonization of financial institutions and continued human capital management and all across the board. And also a very strong example of not being discouraged and continuing to push forward, even if we're not getting the results that we need. And so that is just wonderful to hear. I know your time is limited and you might have to hop from your time with us, but just wanted to see if you had any other final comments before you did have to kind of jet. Or
that's great. For questions people have, honestly, once you get in the weeds, you, me, and our corporate governance team are better to give you the answers anyway. But I just totally agree. And I guess I would only say, look, we have seen that those red state treasurers know how to work together. And it is a war of political distraction, and as I say, at the behest of their fossil fuel and right-wing donors. But by organizing, they are out, punching above their weight class. We have to organize together, because if we want to make sure that we're building that more equally thriving economy, that we're seeing the big picture together. So that's why today is so important. Really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to continuing to work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, Comptroller Lander. Yes, we will continue to be working together. So excited for that opportunity to continue to support the great work that your office is doing there, which I think, leads to our next speaker, Alfonso Mayfield. And I think it's a testament to the groups that we have on today, not only in our audience, but on our panel as well, that it does require us to all work together. So Alfonso, before I kind of ask you some questions, I did want to just kind of give a brief bio of you for joining us. So Alfonso Mayfield is the president of the SEIU Florida Public Services Union, and he also sits on the executive board of the SEIU International Union, which is the union that represents over 2 million diverse members in healthcare, property services, and public sector in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. He serves as the co-chair of SEIU's Racial Justice Center, which was launched in 2017. And he also serves on the boards of numerous other organizations and is dedicated to improving the outcomes for low-income and communities of color in Florida and beyond. Again, we're just scratching the surface here with some of these heavy-hitting panelists, but Alfonso just wanted to kind of uplift you there. And then I did have a couple of questions that I'm hoping you can speak to as we had hoped that only folks, from your perspective, that you could offer some thoughts on the following comments. So, as I mentioned, the Racial Justice Center was established in 2017, and it puts it plainly on its website, right? We cannot achieve economic justice without racial justice. So I'm hoping in your comments, you can help us speak to us what that means in your work, and how does SEIU's work, which is at various levels, right, towards building a prosperous and just economy for all of us. How are racial and economic justice actually connected, and what role does the Racial Justice Center play in driving this connection? And why did SEIU in particular become an active proponent of shareholder measures to advance racial equity auditing in the last few years? So if you could speak to those comments, we'd love to hear from you there.
Sure. Thank you, Whitney. So racial justice and economic justice are inseparable. I think that we aren't that far removed from the pandemic where we saw just one specific instance of a problem showed our complete interdependence on each other. Workers play an important role in the economy and are among the first to feel the negative impacts of systemic racism. Workers are also investors, and a lot of times people forget about that. That's why the SEIU Racial Justice Center exists, and I think we're going to put a link to the Racial Justice Center, or we should, in the chat if possible. So this is a critical issue for our members in their pension funds and benefit plans, and also in how their dollars are spent locally, and including public and Taft-Hartley funds, which a lot of times we forget. Our members are beneficiaries of, and they're also trustees of these plans. So they play an integral role in how they are operationalized. As long-term investors, our members' retirement plans also bear the brunt of an economy built on systemic racial inequalities, and that play out in our communities every day. So new economic research shows what SEIU members and workers across the country have always known, that an economy built on systemic racial inequalities robs us of our truest potential. If we want an economy that's going to continue to grow, an economy that's going to be inclusive, and perform the best that it can, it has to be one that's inclusive and removes systemic racial inequalities. As research from the Federal Reserve has shown, racial inequalities in our labor markets cost the U.S. economy between 2.6 trillion and $3 trillion alone, and that was just in 2019. SEIU became an active proponent of shareholder measures to advance racial equity auditing. So why? Corporate racial equity audits are a mechanism for uncovering and addressing harms and the ways in which a corporation is contributing to systemic racial disparities. Corporate racial equity audits can have significant benefits at the company portfolio level. These proposals call on companies to retain an independent auditor to examine policies, practices, and products, and through engagement with company stakeholders, identify how corporate actions contribute to systemic racial disparities and publicly release the findings, as well as recommendations for how to address them. As a result, these proposals can lead to more than just disclosure of diversity data, although that, of course, is very important. Done properly, they should lead to companies developing sustained plans of action to try to fix ways their business practices exacerbate and harms and creates racial inequalities. SEIU pension funds began filing racial equity audit proposals during the 2021 shareholder season. And now going into 2023 season, there are more of these proposals than ever. According to our partners at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, there are 28 shareholder proposals calling for racial equity audits filed ahead of the coming proxy season. So I think we're going to drop a list in the chat to that as well. Many companies are starting to recognize that addressing racial equity across their products, policies, and operations is best for everyone, and are starting to settle these proposals instead of having them come to a vote. As a result, any company where a racial equity audit shareholder proposal is still on the ballot in 2023 is a company that could have settled and chose not to. And we're seeing several of these getting over the finish line. So for far too long, our members have watched as the asset managers entrusted with their retirement savings, only for those same asset managers to try to weaponize those resources against our members' interests as beneficiaries by shielding boards from accountability on racial injustice, human capital mismanagement, and abuses, and other irresponsible behavior. That's why we as SEIU have joined efforts like this to hold large asset managers accountable. Our members entrust asset managers with our futures. We need them to be upholding the fiduciary duties to their beneficiaries and backing initiatives that address systemic racism in our economy.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, for your comments. Yes, there's so many at various levels. Again, I think SEIU is really driving home why racial equity is important, not only to our workers, our family, those that are directly impacted, but also with the retirement and and funds that are all connected. And so really deeply appreciate your comments and also for uplifting this growing trend that we're continuing to see with racial equity auditing. We know SEIU is a major proponent at many of these companies offering these filings and working with companies in good faith to try to reach investment strategies that incorporate racial equity lens. So thank you so much for your comments. I think that feeds really nicely into what Executive Director of Majority Action, Eli Kazargod-Staub, will speak about in terms of the findings that we had in equity in the boardroom. But again, just reminding folks to please uplift your questions that you may have for Alfonso in the chat, and we will be sure to loop back with them towards the end of the program. Great, yes, and I see some comments in the chat. Please, yes, add an addition to what you know on these areas. So Eli, I just want to, I'm going to kick it to you soon to kind of give us some more intel into what Equity in the Boardroom is covering and what our work at Majority Action is doing in this fight for a prosperous economy for all. But just wanting to, quickly do a quick intro for you as well. And so Eli Kazargod-Staub is the co-founder and executive director of Majority Action, and he also holds a chartered financial analyst designation, so CFA. Previously, he developed engagement strategy for Majority Action's predecessor organization, which is the 50/50 Climate Project and the Climate Majority Project. He also led research and corporate governance initiatives at SEIU and the Australian Council of Trade Unions. So that's also just scratching the surface of the many, many, many accomplishments and skills that Eli holds. But just wanted to, ask you a couple questions, Eli, that I'm hoping that you can respond to for our audience today. So we know here at Majority Action, right, we dig deeply into the proxy voting performance of large asset managers. And we do this in order to empower investors with this knowledge that they can use to ensure that their stewardship interests are being served. So what have we learned about how asset managers have used their proxy voting power that's entrusted to them in this last proxy season in 2022? What do they need to do to ensure that their voting power is being used responsibly going forward? So just wanted to ask you those few questions, if you could speak to that. Great.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you for your leadership here. Thrilled to be able to share some of the core findings and analysis from Equity in the Boardroom and the implications that this has for what responsible proxy voting and asset stewardship really needs to look like. In our work, we start from the recognition that widespread racial inequalities not only create immeasurable harm to directly impacted people and communities, but as both Comptroller Lander and President Mayfield spoke to, they also materially inhibit long-term value creation. And this is research that we've summarized and organized in the Equity in the Boardroom report. I'll just lift up a couple of highlights. Research from the Federal Reserve shows that racial disparities in U.S. labor markets cost the U.S. economy $51 trillion between 1990 and 2019. A 2019 study by McKinsey found that closing racial wealth gaps could increase the U.S. GDP by 4 to 6% by 2028, translating to a per capita increase in GDP of $2,900 to $4,300. This is material impact that would have very significant flow-on effects for economic growth overall, which of course is essential driver of performance for long-term value creation for long-term investors. And so we then also start from the recognition that as much as these inequalities shape the environments in which companies operate, corporate behaviors also shape these broader outcomes. Put simply, companies can either take action to ameliorate these inequities, which quite typically aligns to better management and risk reduction for themselves, or their actions can exacerbate these inequalities, reinforcing both systematic and company-specific risks for long-term investors. And then most fundamentally, we start from the recognition that public companies don't make these decisions in a vacuum. Standards for corporate governance are set by company shareholders through their stewardship and their proxy voting policies and practices. And among company shareholders, the largest asset managers ultimately have the greatest amount of influence in determining these standards. The 20 largest asset managers, which are those analyzed in this report, control $52 trillion in assets under management. And among those 20, just 4, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity, control just under 25 trillion in assets under management, nearly half. Just 3 asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, control approximately 25% of the votes cast on average across S&P 500 companies. So simply put, the voting policies and practices of large asset managers have an outsized impact on the expectations for corporate boards, on matters related to racial equity and justice. Now, these, of course, include on topics on which shareholders vote that are nominally directly related to racial equity, such as board and workforce diversity and racial equity auditing. But the reality, as both Comptroller Lander and President Mayfield have been speaking to, is that an extensive range of topics that are put to shareholder vote have direct implications for racial equity outcomes. Human capital management, corporate transparency on political spending and lobbying activity, product and technology safety, environmental and climate risk mitigation, all directly impact equity outcomes for stakeholders of color. That's why the Equity in the Boardroom report takes a more comprehensive approach to examining the range of shareholder votes that matter for corporate governance of racial equity outcomes. And what this year's report showed was a rather simple and consistent pattern. Across all of the vote categories we evaluated, the majority of asset managers with over $1 trillion in assets under management, supported the majority of these proposals. Speaks to the deeper awareness that has developed among investors across these critical vote topics, particularly since the pivotal moment of the 2020 uprisings. And zooming in, for example, on one particularly essential category, support for racial equity audits. A majority of the asset managers analyzed supported over 2/3 of the audits at which they voted. This, of course, was a strong contributor to why several of these proposals for racial equity auditing broke through to majority support for the first time ever in 2022. At the same time, the 4 largest asset managers lagged behind their peers in support across nearly every critical vote category analyzed. With some distinctions between them, that pattern remained rather consistent across all of the categories. Given their swing vote power, their lagging performance had outsized impact on proxy voting outcomes. By our analysis, out of over 100 proposals analyzed, 44 shareholder proposals related to racial equity and justice could have reached majority support, but for the votes of just one or more of BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, or Fidelity. For example, BlackRock or Vanguard's votes alone would have likely been enough to bring proposals for a racial equity audit at Chevron to majority support, or for political spending alignment at AT&T to majority support, both companies with significant track records of controversy around those dynamics across their operations and policies with respect to racial equity outcomes. And so given these gaps and results, SEIU and Majority Action are recommending that asset managers incorporate a comprehensive racial equity lens into their stewardship and their proxy voting policies. In practice, this translates to a concrete set of steps. Number one, it looks like establishing the reduction of racial inequalities as a goal of proxy voting policies. Leading asset managers do this across a number of issues, such as enabling having proxy voting policies that are directly have the aim of ensuring alignment with 1.5 degree temperature rise. The same can be done here on racial equity outcomes. Second, policies should acknowledge that a wide range of proposal categories can result in positive or negative racial equity impacts, and indicate how they will implement a process for ongoing review of those impacts and to ensure that their policies are designed to ameliorate them. Third, we're recommending that large asset managers incorporate support for proposals calling for racial equity audits as a standard practice. Put simply, racial equity auditing is so important because by enabling the kind of independent review of company practices and policies and products, it provides such an essential insight. We believe that this really has the potential to become and is on its way to becoming a standard part of how companies, particularly large companies in the S&P 500, ongoingly evaluate their impacts. And rather than needing to evaluate these kind of proposals on a case-by-case basis, or even worse, compare a call for a racial equity audit with a company's own self-disclosures, we believe that large asset managers can simply adopt a policy enabling support for these kinds of proposals writ large. And then finally, we believe it is past time for a minimum standard of at least 30% racial and ethnic diversity on corporate boards, and to ensure that boards are held accountable to that standard. That doesn't mean that that needs to be achieved next year, meaning boards can have an opportunity to phase that kind of thing in. But it's so essential when large asset managers set clear expectations, even if those expectations are over to materialize over a couple of years. Those expectations, we've seen time and again how companies then move to respond. And so in short, we believe that taking these steps will support and enable large asset managers to fulfill their fiduciary duty to manage the systematic and company-specific risks for their clients. Thank you so much, Whitney.
Thank you, Eli. Yes, I'm seeing folks reacting in the chat of some good questions. Thank you so much for your comments. I think, yes, building off of the first two speakers as well, just really continues to stress that racial justice as a systemic concern, and that for impact investing, racial equity is a must, is an important lens that we need to identify in risks and opportunities within the analysis that we use. So just hearing both you and Alfonso name these numbers in the trillions, and so knowing that these things have a massive, material impact, and so for asset managers to be lagging on, these range of proposals, is really hard to continue to find the excuses for that. So, I think it's very important work that we're continuing to help lead here at Majority Action, and just really thank you for your comments. And I think it also builds off nicely where I wanted to hope James can speak to us further too on this racial equity processes that, again, we're continuing to see grow in the investor ecosystem, continue to see shareholder interest around them, and to really to evaluate impact, across a range of issues. I think this is exciting for those of us who are looking at audits as a growing tool within the ecosystem. But first, James, before I kick it to you to give us some of your comments, I just wanted to quickly introduce you. It's such an honor again to have you on the call. Grateful, folks may know, James is one of the co-founders of Majority Action as well, so holds a deep spot in our organizational heart. But also James Rucker is a veteran civil rights activist, organizational leader, and pioneering developer of new strategies and organizations. He co-founded Color of Change, the largest online civil rights organization, also co-founded Majority Action, which I mentioned. He served on numerous boards of civil rights organizations to advance racial justice and democracy. This includes the Southern Poverty Law Center and MoveOn.org. He currently serves as the chair of the board of the Leadership Conference Education Fund. And yeah, we're scratching the surface with all these speakers, but that just highlights some of the incredible leadership that you've been able to demonstrating, James, and just so, again, grateful to have you. Just wanted to see if you could help us, kind of get a little bit more into the civil rights perspective here around why this work continues and remains so important. And so the civil rights leader across many organizations, you've seen a lot, right? But you've also seen corporations take action to address racial injustice, but you've also seen companies that make big commitments but fail to live up to their promises. So from your perspective, can you share what makes a racial, with this opportunity of racial equity audits, what makes a racial equity audit, credible and an actual audit? Why is it important to engage the people that are directly impacted within these processes? Could you also offer some insight into what is a good example of what stakeholder engagement could look around like in terms of racial equity audits, and why we see stakeholder engagement as so important? And in those comments too, if you could just connect us to see how you see this as a continuation of the civil rights movement and the work that you've been so involved in as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And not only thanks for having me, thanks for doing this work. It's interesting. This landscape, I would say, is a part of the picture of society that a lot of folks don't pay attention to, or they don't understand. For a long time, I had a 401k and I'd get these things in the mail and I'm like, okay, do I have to do something? No. Okay, fine. Having no idea of what the significance of my investment, along with all these other folks' investments, means in terms of, decisions that are being made that affect our lives, having no idea that our dollars actually connect to power. We look at political power, but most folks don't recognize, and I'm thankful forever for Eli to help kind of bringing me into this realm, several years ago, because I do see it as an extension of a larger social justice, kind of that terrain. And it's similar to me in terms of voting rights. Nothing's going to happen overnight, right? And you're going to have folks, and just as you just said, Winnie, you're going to have folks and organizations who talk a certain talk, and in fact, may have an intention of walking a certain walk, but if you circle back a year or two later, that just can be deprioritized. And this is why I think it's so important, not only that the folks like who are on this call and participating, are privy to what's happening, but that everyday people are as well, right? Because it's our, and I loved, I'm like, oh, can I take Comptroller Leonard to lunch? Because I just want to hear more of his perspective, because it's, seeing how steeped our futures, right, are in the economy through this landscape is critical. And it's critical for holding companies accountable to their best intentions, right? And to helping them remember where they say their priorities are. And in the long view, it's not just, what we think of as or I think what a lot of folks think of as kind of the investor class. It's everybody. Where are we going to be in 5 years? Where are we going to be in 10 years? And the idea that, and it seems like kind of duh, but that not having a certain kind of representation at a board level, not having the benefit of a racial equity audit where you're able to put sunlight on the practices broadly of an organization and organization's culture, to not have that opportunity means to basically squander value one place or another. These things catch up to us, right? A blind eye, might work for a period of time, but it won't, work forever. And I think importantly, in terms of connecting to the civil rights movement overall, like voting rights, you will have certain things on paper and they'll be subverted, right? You got to get it right on paper, but that's not enough, right? And so to me, one of the more exciting developments, and I'm really excited for not only what Majority Action, but SEIU and groups like Color of Change, folks coming together actually and recognizing, to actually get to the kind of target state or the target trajectory, it's going to take staying power. I like, Whitney, how you said to the comptroller, his patience, or not giving up, because I often want to give up. Like, this takes too long, but I understand how these systems work. So just to a few of your questions, Whitney, because I have so many things that from folks' remarks that are now in my brain and have wheels turning. I think part of it is, having independence, having an independent, credible, team do the work, and having unfettered access basically to folks on the inside and information, I think is very risky. Companies like Airbnb, where there was a willingness, and I saw a little bit of this, firsthand. You kind of open the kimono, and you don't know everything. You've done something wrong. There are ways to improve. Now, the thing is, once you recognize that, oh, we've had a blind spot here, we need to focus more here, then you can actually create value, right? There's no benefit in kind of, hiding, and that, yeah, there's vulnerability in a certain kind of, let's say, short-term risk, but the benefits, and what you're able to do both for your customers, your clients, for your workers, and also for the broader economy. If you're creating value, that value gets recognized, and you can only create that value if you, step into that zone of, okay, what am I not doing as well as I should? So that, I think, the independence, the ability for folks who are inside of an organization to participate freely in a real audit. And then I think it's about actually, having findings be public. Now, I know that there have been like negotiations, and there's, look, again, nothing has to be like black and white 100% overnight, but taking that step toward looking in, right, and enabling that to inform the behaviors, the culture, the decisions that get made, I think is critical. And, again, you'll have, I think, folks who are well-intentioned, but if the pressure isn't there, it doesn't stick. And so having, so there were a group of civil rights leaders, I want to say a few months ago, that basically sent a letter to this effect, basically saying, look, you may have, agreed to a racial equity audit. Let's look at the specifics to make sure it's real. And let's look at what the disclosure of the results will be to make sure it's real. And that accountability can be had. And it doesn't have to be, confrontational, right? It can be cooperative, but there has to be real accountability just for their own sake. And, we see what happens when that is not on the table, in the wake of, the uprisings and a focus on state violence. all kinds of, for it's great marketing, pledging this and pledging to do that. But again, even a well-meaning actor at the end of the day, if the light isn't continually shown, if there isn't really built-in accountability, those dollars move away. Those commitments basically vanish. And so I think, let me see if there's anything else I wanted to throw in here before we move on. Let's see. Yeah, I think, yeah, this is I'm very excited that folks are more and more connecting the dots, folks who aren't in the kind of investment arena, because I do think this is, you know, our and again, I obviously have a few perspectives here. One is, yes, there's, you know, long-term returns. There's also having a world, being in a context where folks who are doing work are respected for the work they do. You know, folks who are contributing get a slice of that return, right? And you don't have a society where people are, you know, participating in doing what they're supposed to do, but are continually marginalized and subjugated. And I think, again, at the end of the day, when we create the right circumstances, you know, we can actually get to a very different place. And I'm really looking forward, I guess I would just say, I really, the big asset managers, in my mind, I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. You don't benefit long-term, right? By not actually, this racial equity audit thing's been well thought through. It makes sense. It delivers results. You can look at the practices of Airbnb where I've seen it firsthand. I saw my own experiences prior to the process as a not a host, what is it? As someone who rents Airbnbs, to afterwards. Material difference, greater value for you know, me as someone who's on the platform. And we should really have that kind of change throughout the ecosystem. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much again for having me and for having this discussion.
Thank you so much for your comments, James. Yes, I love how everything's building off of one another, and it really does, right, take a comprehensive approach. I think we're not in denial in terms of, you know, where a lot of our economies and systems have been, and that does not mean that we can't create a new or kind of do that audit and figure out, you know, what we need to do differently. And so just really appreciate all of our panelists, but yes, in particular, James, what you're uplifting here in terms of what it means to have, you know, processes that actually engage stakeholders, and it does, you know, center a lot of the ways that people who are being impacted, and it's not kind of just this rhetorical lip service type of strategies that we're, you know, us as responsible investors want to really engage in. And so how do we pull those various levers and really, again, have to take a comprehensive approach at every level around these types of issues. So thank you to our panelists. We have some great questions that are coming up in the chat. I want to move us to there. As a reminder for folks, this is going till the 45 mark. So we will have time for the questions for those who can stick around and join, but just wanted to invite all of our panelists to join me back on screen. And then I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that we have for us here. And as a reminder, Yumi Narita is joining us on behalf of the New York City Comptroller Office. So very excited. Thank you again for joining us here. Lander had to jump off. So let me see. I got some questions here. So let me ask the first one, and if we could paste this in the doc for our panelists, that'd be great too. But I'll speak it out loud and see who wants to speak to this one. So to advance racial equity audits, and also known as civil rights audits, right? Does the big four, meaning the asset managers, have to jump in for us to see action, or can a collection of coalition of boutique asset managers be enough? So that's a great question. Does anyone have any burning thoughts around that? Do we need to move the big four? Can we take a boutique approach? Or
I'm happy to jump in on this. I think the answer is all of the above, meaning we operate in an ecosystem in which we have investors that are leaders in proposing racial equity audits, leaders in engaging with companies, leaders in doing the very deep and complex work of drawing the links and the connections between social and environmental outcomes, corporate governance best practices, systematic and company-specific risks and value creation opportunities. And boutique investors and boutique asset managers play an absolutely essential role in advancing the conversation forward and being able to help socialize those kinds of ideas and standards. And ultimately, in our ecosystem of corporate governance, the voting power of the largest asset managers is so significant as to result in outcomes where their votes determine so often whether key initiatives related to racial equity and justice and other critical ESG topics, whether they're swinging to majority support or not. So all of that is to frankly uplift and honor the essential role that everyone in the ecosystem, in fact, plays in achieving these kinds of outcomes, and that it requires both proponents who can step forward and conduct this engagement and set these standards, and also asset managers who are entrusted with the retirement savings and other dynamics of or other aspects of resource allocation for literally millions, tens of millions of people in our country and beyond, to uphold their duties to support those with their votes.
Thanks so much, Eli. Both and. Any other comments on that question? Great. We do have a question that I think is we have multiple ways to answer, but one, oh, great. And so actually, in addition to that question, let's continue on this thread of racial equity audits and this anti-ESG backlash that we are also all are experiencing in some ways. So corporate racial equity audits saw increased support, right, from shareholders in 2022, which we covered during this time of anti-ESG backlash, so these were happening at the same time. How can we continue to build the momentum around these equity audits and to do so in a way that undermines the anti-ESG backlash? So I know we've touched on it a little, but I'd love to, if we can just dive a little bit further in terms of what this moment is requiring for us to do and organize around. And
Well, I'll say one small thing. I think one thing is required of us is to not be silent. I think this is actually directly connected to the last question as well. We can't wait until the big players actually get their voices into the game. Any coalition of the willing that's willing to speak on behalf of racial equity audits and be a player to help move racial equity audits is needed in this moment. And to also do some reframing, talking about the harmful effects of the anti-ESG rhetoric and to be quite frankly, the very negative impacts it's going to have to pension funds and plans and to the people that it's supposed to be enacted on behalf of.
Can I add to that? Am I on mute? No, I'm not on mute. Great. No, thanks. I appreciate what you just said, Alfonso. I think also, and this is in this domain and just elsewhere where I've done work, is being quite honest and frank about what's going on, right? And I'm not in the weeds as some of you all are in terms of the arguments being made, but you have, well, like the controller said, you have folks with an agenda, and it's and they're in coordination and they're telling a particular story. I've seen this with something that's not related to this realm, but the whole, critical race theory. There are folks who want the world to work a certain way, and this becomes terrain that can be used to kind of achieve their values. And so to understand that, to call things out for what they are. I mean, I've been around the arguments for things like, I was going to say racial equity audits, but the idea of returns, long-term value, basically correlating to looking at these factors, not hiding the ball over here and pretending that's not creating risk. So when you have folks who are coming and saying, oh, this is going to be bad for however they're making the argument, being straight up and bold, and not being too nuanced, not being too kind, not creating like safety, which frankly doesn't actually create the pressure needed to create the outcomes, the machinations to happen, and then the outcomes that you need. So I would say, and others can speak more about things in a domain specific way, but I think that's being organized, as the comptroller said, being clear about what a group is saying, what the anti-ESG folks are saying and why, and being honest about that. And then speak to actually why this is important, how it connects to, long-term shareholder value. I think that's the, kind of, for me at least, one of the most important things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those additional comments. Yes, so we're going to continue the questions and answers. Again, we're going to go to the 45 mark. So folks who can stick around, we definitely invite you. There was one question, if some of the one wanted to speak to some of the standards that we have for racial equity audits and what to improve or to expect a level of quality from this audit. And I do invite folks to download Equity in the Boardroom if you haven't already. Those standards are present in there. Also uplifts an action that we took with civil rights leaders that sent letters off to the companies that are actively undergoing racial equity audits, uplifting some of these standards, which include an independent auditor, again, making sure that it's not an in-house self-diagnosis from a company, but really having an auditor with deep civil rights experience come in and perform those audits, as well as publishing those findings and being transparent about what's being found and committing to actionable action plans around those findings. And the process is also, we believe that these standards also need to include stakeholder engagement as a prime area of these audits. And so again, making sure those that are most impacted by systemic racism or by the potential practices and behaviors of the company are being interviewed within these audits as well. So the report, again, will go into further detail on that. I know James touched on that as well. So just wanted to uplift that a little, that question. I think that was easily answered, and then kind of get us back to some content questions for our panelists. And I think this one came up. So in addition to knowing this guidance is extremely important, how important is the push at the legislative level? Is there a plan to collectively campaign and push at the SEC level for Chair Gensler to approve the AMAC committee recommendations for disclosure in the asset management industry? Yeah, so any takers on that? Maybe Yumi or other folks want to speak to what this looks like at a legislative level?
So I guess I can say that because I'm the proxy for the politician. Currently, I would say no. I think, the SEC has been sort of in overdrive in terms of asking investors for data points that they would find important for their investment risk. So we've done a lot in terms of climate and board diversity, and I think we're waiting for human capital management to come down so we can write on that. And I think I would push many investors to incorporate this within human capital management umbrella in terms of what kind of information you would want that you can trust from the companies in which you invest. But I will take that back to the comptroller. I feel like that is in his ball house in terms of the AMAC committee. So I will take that back to him.
If I can build on Yumi's remarks here, I think one of the when we think about the policy domain here, we are seeing some very short-sighted and dangerous for long-term investors moves by some in the policy domain, both at the state and federal levels, and particularly want to call attention to an effort led by some in Congress, both in the House and Senate, to overturn the Department of Labor's rule that went into effect just this month, the so-called ESG rule that merely makes clear that pension plan fiduciaries and retirement plan fiduciaries are empowered, not required even, but empowered to consider environmental, social, and governance factors in how they make investment and proxy voting decisions. This is, at this point in 2023, it is literally investing 101. And what it means for investors to have a political attack against that which is so central to modern investment management and stewardship is really beyond the pale. And so that's one that I'd really encourage both investors and civil society organizations to pay close attention to as members of Congress are attempting to overturn that rule through the CRA process. And that's one that frankly just matters tremendously in terms of how well frankly, how well we're allowed to speak the truth of what is already true. Does that make sense? In other words, how well we're able to say what we already know to be true, which is that paying attention to environmental and social and governance factors addresses and mitigates both company-specific and systematic risks for long-term investors. And bringing those into asset management and stewardship decisions is merely good practice.
Yeah, maybe this is, what is it? Being the horse. I forget the metaphor. The countering that. I mean, Eli, you think you just described the dynamic, but countering that, and I don't know what players are in a position to do so, but it's critical. Organized countering is critical. It won't take care of itself. It can't be ignored. And I've just seen in many different areas of just kind of political and social change where, there's this understanding that, well, this argument doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't have to make sense if the right people are pushing it hard and there's not a counter, right? And so, and where there isn't leadership within governance in terms of, federal politics, then you have to create it. You have to create the will. You know what I mean? It's almost like, why do I have to fight this false argument over here? Because it will have tremendous impact if you don't. So anyway, I just can't say enough. I often find folks are thinking someone else is going to handle that or be on the ball there. And in fact, people will be, but you have to find the folks, or you have to back those up who are leading, and you have to pressure those who aren't ready to lead and help them get ready. So.
I'm on mute. Thank you all for those comments. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. And our last one will kind of lead into offering some resources and support for responsible investors who are interested in continuing to demonstrate their commitment to racial equity. But before we get there into our call of action, just wanted to offer this question to panelists, which is, one of the recommendations that the Equity in the Boardroom report makes is that for asset managers to review and update their stewardship and proxy voting policies to incorporate a comprehensive racial equity lens. Are there any of our panelists able to kind of speak to what does a comprehensive racial equity lens entail? And how do we help hold asset managers accountable to that?
I'm happy to start to speak to that just from the content of Equity in the Boardroom, and all of the other panelists will have important insights onto this essential question about what needs to be held in a racial equity lens and proxy voting. But just at first principles, what it starts from is recognizing that that actions are not neutral, that proxy voting actions, just like other kinds of actions, are not neutral. They either advance the amelioration of systemic racial inequalities, or they reinforce them. But there's not a neutral. And so as a result, any kind of proxy voting policy across any kind of category is going to either make progress or inhibit that progress by shielding boards from accountability. And so what we believe that a comprehensive equity lens looks like is examining all of the different kinds of proposal types and categories, both management proposals like director elections and also shareholder proposals across a range of topics, and asking the question, does advancing the kind of work that the proposal calls for, does it advance racial equity or undermine racial equity? And allowing that to be a lens, it's not the sole determinant, but a lens on how a proxy voting policy would then be shaped. So what we've done with Equity in the Boardroom is frankly attempt to model what would it look like to look at a set of categories and ask that question, right? And to look across these different kind of dimensions, and whether it's, again, on human capital management, political and lobbying spending, disclosure and alignment, racial equity auditing, worker safety and rights, diversity and equity and inclusion inside corporate workforces, policies and practices, or rather products and practices at whether it's consumer products companies or tech companies, et cetera, that all of these have outsized impact. Other dimensions that really need to incorporate a racial equity lens include climate risk and environmental risks, particularly as research from the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level and others have conclusively demonstrated that communities of color are at particularly heightened levels of risk from a warming planet in the United States. And so taking that holistic lens means looking at each of those proposal categories and whether or not how voting patterns either contribute to or undermine efforts to hold boards to clear standards and accountability across those various dimensions. That's how we've conceived of it and described it in the report. But again, I'm sure the other esteemed panelists here have deep insight into how we think about applying racial equity lenses to a topic like proxy voting.
Great. Any other thoughts? I mean, I think Eli, yeah, you did a fantastic job.
I think Eli nailed it. I'll just add a completely related perspective on it. Just business is about risk management, and it's about creating competitive advantage by knowing what your competitors don't know. So we're talking about instances where corporations are leaving money on the table and access to communities and the ability to expand capital and open up markets by actually not identifying these things that create a higher level of risk or create disparities, which potentially cut off markets. This is something that's in their best interest to do, right? And so I think when we talk to our members about it, we're talking about it from the perspective of opportunities and how it should be framed as such, and how the opposition is in many ways doing something that's cutting off opportunity.
Absolutely. That perspective is incredibly important. And yeah, I think as we were wrapping up this webinar, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but just really want to thank everyone for offering those questions. We have recorded them and we will do our best to follow up as needed, but just wanting to kind of, again, re-offer this idea of what are we even talking about when we talk about racial equity? And I think all of our speakers have spoken so powerfully to what that means. And we really are building towards a future where race is no longer an outcome that can determine someone's life, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about racial equity. And so continuing to build our investment strategies and our practices and our commitments towards that vision and that goal is important work. And so again, we thank you all so much for joining us. We invite you to, as a call to action, right, in this upcoming AGM season and proxy voting season, to really use your votes with a racial equity lens, but also to review your own proxy voting policies with that lens in mind, and continue to engage your asset managers as well, right? This is a comprehensive approach that really requires attention at every level to demonstrate this commitment to racial equity. And so in addition to the recommendations that you'll find in Equity in the Boardroom, I think we've shared a couple of links in the chat that we'll also share in our follow-up communications to you all, with proxy voting guides coming from ICCR, as well as Majority Action. We'll have a couple of our voting lists coming up for folks who are interested in the wide range of proposals that we are considering. It's not just racial equity audits, as Eli mentioned, it's climate in there, board diversity, political spending and lobbying, human capital management, tech oversight, right? So again, our lens has a wide reach that we are considering in order to drive this work home. So we are at time. If there's anything last minute from the panelists that you wanted to uplift, again, just thank you so much for all your contributions and your work in this field. It's been amazing to spend this afternoon with you, and I look forward to continuing to build power for this good cause here. But yeah, and just long-term value association as well. So there's all good things coming from this kind of work. And again, for those shareholders and investors that are committed to this and want support and help, please reach out to us. We will send our contact information for those registered guests in order to be in touch with us. We have resources, and would just love to be in conversation with you as you continue to establish racial equity within the finance system.